welcome back to the Deep Dive. I think it's safe to say that anyone tuning in is looking to get a grasp on the big shifts happening in our world, especially right now when things feel, well, pretty intense on the global economic front.
Yeah, intense is a good word for it. Definitely a lot to unpack.
Exactly. And that's why we're here. Today, we're zeroing in on President Trump's latest trade policy announcements, specifically those tariffs.
Right.
There's been a whirlwind of reactions already, both internationally and here at home, and we're going to break it all down for you. So think of this as your deep dive into what these tariffs really mean, what the immediate impact might be, and where things could go from here.
Yeah, it's a complex situation for sure. One thing that jumps out right away is, these policies aren't just a simple across-the-board kind of thing.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What's the core of these tariffs?
So essentially, there's this baseline 10% tariff on pretty much everything coming into the U.S.
10% on everything. Got it. But then there's this whole other layer with the reciprocal tariffs. What's the deal with those? How do they work?
Okay, so reciprocal tariffs are basically mirroring the tariffs that other countries already have on U.S. goods. So for instance, China has something like a 20% tariff on a lot of American products already, and under this new policy, they're facing an additional 14% reciprocal tariff.
On top of that 10%?
Yeah, exactly.
So we're talking a total of 34%.
Yep, 34%. Think about things like, consumer electronics, apparel, all kinds of stuff could become much more expensive for American households.
Makes sense. So it's like a direct response to existing tariffs. And then we have Australia, which I understand is facing a much lower reciprocal tariff.
Yeah, so Australia's reciprocal tariff is around 10%, which, reflects the fact that they have generally lower tariffs on American goods in the first place. It's this whole tit-for-tat kind of approach based on whatever the existing situation is.
Interesting. Now, there were a couple of exceptions to these reciprocal tariffs,
right?
Canada and Mexico. But even they aren't completely off the hook.
Absolutely. So they might not get hit with those extra reciprocal tariffs, but they still face a 25% tariff on goods.
Okay, so still a pretty significant barrier.
Oh, yeah. And Canada, on top of that, has to deal with a 10% tariff on energy products.
Got it. So big picture, what's the administration hoping to achieve with all of this?
Well, the main argument is that these tariffs will encourage foreign companies to invest directly in the U.S.
So make imports more expensive and hopefully incentivize companies to create jobs here instead.
Exactly. The idea is that it'll become more economically attractive to, set up shop and build factories right here in the U.S. In fact, the announcement even used the term Liberation Day for American industry.
Liberation Day. Wow, that's pretty strong language.
Yeah, it definitely signals a pretty major shift in policy.
It does. So how is the rest of the world reacting to all of this? It doesn't sound like everyone's thrilled.
You're right. The general response has been, well, let's just say not very positive. There's a lot of disappointment, a lot of concern, particularly from global leaders. They're worried about the impact this could have on the global economy as a whole and on existing trade relationships.
And some pretty prominent figures have been quite vocal in their criticism.
Oh, yeah. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, she called these tariffs a major blow to the world economy.
Wow.
And even went so far as to say that the EU would be considering countermeasures. Meaning, they might slap retaliatory tariffs on American goods headed for Europe. So the message from Europe is pretty clear. Now let's look at Asia.
Okay. And what about China? They weren't exactly silent either.
No, not at all. China's foreign ministry put out a statement saying that, there are no winners in trade wars and tariff wars.
Makes sense. No one wants to see things escalate.
Right.
And they're supposedly blaming their own countermeasures as well.
Yeah, that seems to be the consensus.
Now, Japan, historically a close economic ally of the U.S., also expressed some pretty serious concerns.
Prime Minister Ishiba said he's worried about a potential great impact on the U.S.-Japan relationship, but also on the global economy as a whole. He was pretty clear that Japan's going to be looking at its options to protect its interests. So yeah, a lot of concern coming from Japan.
Even Australia, which you mentioned is facing a lower reciprocal tariff, isn't exactly on board with all of this.
Nope, not at all. Prime Minister Albanese said that even with the lower tariff, they're still going to be negotiating with the U.S. to try and get these tariffs removed. He's not interested in participating in what he called a race to the bottom.
Which could lead to?
Well, higher prices for consumers, a slowdown in economic growth, all the things no one really wants.
Right. And then we have Canada and Mexico, even with that reciprocal tariff exemption, they're pushing back too.
Absolutely. Prime Minister Carney of Canada has straight up said they're going to fight these tariffs with countermeasures.
Strong words.
Yeah. And in Mexico, President Sheinbaum announced that they're working on a comprehensive program to deal with the situation. So no one's taking this lying down.
Not surprising. And finally, we have the UK, which, at least initially, seemed to be taking a slightly more cautious approach.
Yeah, Prime Minister Starmer acknowledged that, President Trump was acting on his mandate, which I thought was interesting wording. But he also made it clear that nothing is off the table.
Okay, so playing it a bit close to the chest for now.
Seems like it. He did mention that the UK is working on an economic prosperity deal with the US, so they're definitely looking for ways to, soften the blow, so to speak.
So internationally, there's definitely a lot of anxiety about where all of this might lead. Now, let's shift gears and look at the reaction here in the U.S. And it's interesting because it's not just a simple partisan split.
Yeah, not at all. You've got some really nuanced reactions coming from different corners, and Representative Golden from Maine is a prime example.
Right. He's actually been a proponent of a universal tariff himself.
Exactly. Back in, January, he proposed the Built USA Act, which called for a 10% universal tariff.
So he sees some merit in the core concept of President Trump's plan.
He does. He actually said he was pleased that the president was basing his tariff agenda on this idea of a universal 10% tariff. And he even offered to work with the president to make it law.
So he's on board with that part, but he's a bit more cautious about those additional tariffs that were announced.
Yeah, he wants to see more details, make sure they're actually going to benefit working people. He's advocating for a more comprehensive approach where tariffs are just one piece of the puzzle.
Makes sense. Now, what about the other Democrats? They seem to be taking a more traditional stance.
Yeah, some have expressed concern about, the way these tariffs are being implemented, calling it chaotic and too immediate.
Okay.
And then you have others like Representative Meeks who are planning to try and block the whole thing. He's calling the national emergency justification a made-up excuse.
Wow, so definitely a range of reactions, even within the Democratic Party. Now, it's worth noting that Representative Golden represents a district that voted for President Trump in 2024. Right. Do you think that has anything to do with his position on this?
I mean, it's certainly a factor. Representing a district with that kind of political lean definitely shapes his perspective. He's got to be responsive to his constituents, many of whom are in manufacturing-heavy areas that, could be directly affected by these policies.
Absolutely. Okay, so taking all of this into account, what are the key themes that emerge? What are the potential implications for the future?
Well, globally, we're seeing this tension between wanting to negotiate and the very real threat of retaliation. It's creating a lot of uncertainty about how trade relationships are going to evolve.
Makes sense.
And then domestically, there's this debate over whether these tariffs will actually work and whether they'll hurt more than they help, driving up prices and slowing down growth.
Right, the classic arguments against tariffs.
Exactly. But it is interesting to see some degree of agreement on this idea of a universal tariff, even if there's still disagreement on the overall strategy.
Definitely a complex situation with no easy answers. So to summarize, we've got these new tariffs from President Trump, a baseline 10% on imports, plus reciprocal tariffs, with some exceptions and additions thrown in. The international community is largely not happy, ranging from disappointment to threats of retaliation. And here in the U.S., we've got mixed reactions, with some Democrats finding common ground with the president on the idea of a universal tariff.
That's a good summary. It's a really dynamic situation, and the impacts are probably going to be felt for a while.
Absolutely. And so here's our final thought for you. Given all of these different perspectives and the stated goals of boosting domestic investment and creating jobs here, what do you see as the most likely long-term outcome of all of this? How will these tariffs affect global trade and the American economy in the years to come? There's a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Thanks for having me.